Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. In his work, The Poetics, after describing what Lexis, or diction, the fourth element of tragedy, has as its important components, all the aspects and elements of language, Aristotle is going to then go on and explore what makes it good in a piece of poetry, in a tragedy, for example, or a lyric poem, or an epic, or even comedy. And what he's going to tell us applies primarily to tragedy, also to some degree to epic. He says you want to avoid sliding into something that looks like comedy, which you can if you screw up. And so this excellence, or arete, the same word that we use for virtue, right, is going to consist of two different main aspects, which are not always easy to reconcile with each other. And you might think about the advice that people give about writing in general. Oh, always be as clear as possible in writing. Well, that wouldn't actually produce good tragedy for Aristotle, at least not in the respect of Lexis or diction. So the two key aspects are going to be clarity, that it needs to have saphe, it needs to be saphe in this case. That's applying to Lexis. And what does this mean? It means that you can see literally what's there. And so picture this metaphorically as you can understand, you can make out what is actually being said by the words that the people are using. And then avoiding what's translated as banality, me tapenein. And so tapenos, or tapene, is a term that we sometimes translate as humility or lowness or modesty. You know, for example, in Nicomachean Ethics, Book 4, when Aristotle is describing honor and virtues that are concerned with that, there's a virtue or a middle state that is understanding that you're kind of a lowly person and you don't expect a lot. So you're not high-minded or high-souled, great-souled, but you're also not vain or small-souled either. You understand what you're worth. So think of it as lowness, banality in that sense. We want the things that are conveying interesting thoughts to not just be about the everyday. And even if it is about the everyday, it could be described in non-everyday language. And these are going to be, to some degree, difficult to bring together properly, to harmonize, to balance out. So he's going to go on and say that the clearest diction, or clearest Lexis, uses standard terms, uses terms that we're all familiar with. Right? But this is banal. And so he says the poetry of Cleophon and Sthenelus illustrates this. Unfortunately, we don't actually have them. But, you know, you could think of all sorts of writing that we have in the present where you read it, you understand what it means, but you wouldn't say, wow, that's really cool, that captivates me, or anything along those lines. So if you're too clear, it's going to be banal. So we could say maximizing one aspect, you end up minimizing the other aspect. And we want to figure out how to maximize them both at the same time. So Aristotle's going to clue us into this linguistically. If we want our language to be impressive, as he says, semne, right? August is another way we could translate that. And to be above the ordinary, exelachusa to idiotikon, the regular, the ordinary, well, then we have to use exotic language. Now, exotic there is a translation of xenikon, and xenos means foreign or foreigner, right? So we got to use language that isn't necessarily coming from somewhere else, although loan words will be. We got to use language that's different than what we typically use every day, or technical uses of language, say medical terminology or philosophical terminology that might not be as applicable to artistic language. And so what are the ways in which we do that? He's going to talk about three main devices, and he's talking about lengthening. So lengthening is being used here as sort of a stand-in for all the things that we might do with words, not just lengthening, but also shortening them, using different forms of them. But we also talk about loan words. Now, what are loan words? English is full of them, and actually, ancient Greek had quite a few of these as well. A loan word is a word that you're taking from somewhere else, some other language or some other use within your own language, right? Xenikon, that is a way to describe it, coming from somebody else's culture. Then we have metaphors. Okay, so we're going to talk about metaphor a little bit more in just a bit. That was a very important aspect of Lexis to begin with. Lengthenings, and then divergence from the usual, right? Pan to para to kurion. You could also translate it divergence from the standard. From the kurion is what is dominant, what we usually use. So we can make our language better by using these sorts of techniques. Now, the problems that arise if we try to use this too much are twofold. If we use too many metaphors, then he says we get a riddle. And it's interesting, sometimes people use that phrase, a riddle wrapped in an enigma. Those are the same word in Greek, right? Enigma means riddle. So the riddle, why would you have a riddle using too many metaphors? Well, he says this is the nature of a riddle, to attach impossibilities to a description of real things. You cannot do this by composing with other terms, but you can with metaphors. And so he uses an example. I saw a man welding bronze on a man with fire. Now, what does that actually mean? He's talking about a smith, right, doing his work. Can you literally weld on a living person? Well, no, not for long, because you're going to kill him if you do. But, so there's an impossibility there. But you can understand what he's saying, right? Producing a suit of armor. And it's interesting, too, because why didn't you just say that? Why didn't you be really clear? Well, then it would be banal, right? So we're using all sorts of metaphors, and then it winds up being a little bit too murky. If we use too many loan words, then what we get is barbarism, and that's literally the term, barbarismos, right? Meaning what those goofy foreigners who we can't really understand say. And, bar is the way that Greeks thought of foreigners talking who didn't really understand Greek. It just sounded, we have that expression, it's all Greek to me. The Greeks would say, it's all bar to me. So if you use too many loan words that people are not familiar with, well, then you're going to have a problem with that as well. So what do we need to do? He talks about a blend of these. And this shows us that we need a certain kind of proportionality. We may even need a kind of prudence or at least cleverness in order to be able to do this well. So that's going to be an important aspect. He says that we want to create an impression that's not banal, that's elevated, right? That is captivating people's attention. But we want it also to be clear enough that they can figure out what the hell we're talking about, right? So how do we do that? He says, here we get to that aspect that I was talking about before. A major contribution to clarity and unusualness of diction is made by lengthenings, making the words longer, shortenings, and then modifications of words, right? So contrasting with the standard, divergence from the usual creates an out of the ordinary impression. And he says we got to be careful with this, of course, right? We need to be moderate. He says the blatant use of such a manner is ridiculous, laughable, so could be useful in comedy. Moderation applies equally, koinon, to all components. So he says by using metaphors, loanwords, and the other things inexpertly, one could achieve the same result as by deliberate comic distortion, right? And that is making something laughable, epitagoloia. So we don't want to do that in tragedy. I suppose maybe we want a few comedic elements or something like that. You know, Thersites in the Iliad, getting himself beaten up. That's kind of a comedic moment. But in general, we don't want that. So we need moderation in using all of these things. And he's going to close this by talking about metaphor. Before that, though, he says that using these terms, loanwords, metaphors, we could observe the truth of my argument by substituting standard terms. So, for example, take a play by Aeschylus or a play by Euripides and look at the language that they're using and then translate it into more banal, everyday language. Aeschylus in the Philoctetes wrote, "The cancer which eats the flesh of my foot." Euripides changed eats to feasts on. Likewise, with one now lowly, paltry, and unseemly, we could substitute the standard terms, one small, weak, and ugly, and we're not going to get the same effect. So we need to be attentive to this. And he goes on and says, you shouldn't make fun of the tragedians for using elevated language. That's what makes it actually good. And if we want to use metaphor, this might be a little bit debatable, right? But Aristotle is going to say the capacity for metaphor, metaphorikon, the art, we could say, of metaphor, there's two things he's going to say about it. It's a sign of what we could translate as natural gifts, euphuias, good nature, right? And it also cannot be acquired from another. Par alu esti laben, right? Uta par alu esti laben. It's literally not to be taken from another person. We might say, well, wait a second, are you sure about that? Because he's willing to say that these other things can be learned by going to others. And Aristotle himself seems to be providing us here in the Poetics and even more in the Rhetoric in Book 3 with schemas for creating metaphors, for deriving metaphors, for extending them, and thereby being good at it. But Aristotle also seems to say, well, you can do that mechanical operation, but that doesn't actually make you good at producing metaphors. Why? Using metaphor, well, literally to metaphor in a good manner, eu metapheren, to bring things from one area into another, requires or involves discerning similarities, to homoion theorein, to be able to see or grasp similarities that other people aren't, but could be. So, for example, the metaphor that we talked about in a different place, the analogy of Dionysus and the wine cup to Ares and the shield, somebody came up with that. And when we see that and we know what the terms mean, Dionysus is the god of wine, and a wine cup is a circular thing that's tied in with his main operations, and Ares is the god of war, and a shield is also circular, at least for the Greeks, so it's tied in with his thing. A is to C as B is to D. We get a nice thing there, a analogy as we call it, right? Somebody came up with that. And once somebody does come up with that, we can be like, oh, yeah, I get it. Could you come up with that yourself? Maybe. But that would require being able to discern similarities. And we do see people constantly coming up with new metaphors, some of which stick, some of which don't. Right? The metaphors themselves could be good ones or bad ones. They could be interesting, but perhaps unclear or too banal, right? So they could also have these characteristics applied to them. So this is what Aristotle gives us as far as what good Lexis is going to look like within tragedy and probably also by extension within epic poetry as well.